Month series is supported by the County Maui Office of Economic Development. Tonight's presenter is Dr. Scott Fisher of Hawaiian Islands Land Trust. He'll be speaking about using the distant past as a guide for future decision-making about restoring and managing coastal lands in Waiahi and other parts of Hawaii. But first, just a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that your microphone is on mute. Please keep it on mute during the presentation to avoid distractions. But we do really invite you to submit questions by using the questions button or the Q&A button on the lower edge of your screen. And I'll be keeping an eye on those questions during the presentation. And we'll also leave some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. And with that, I wanted to introduce you to Scott Fisher, PhD. Scott grew up in Kula and after serving in the U.S. Marine Corps, studied at Colorado State University. His graduate work includes an MA in Peace Studies with a concentration in Native Hawaiian strategies of peacemaking and reconciliation. His PhD explored the dynamics of post-Civil War recovery on the island of Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, including how communities make wise decisions about conflicts over natural resources. Scott also holds a graduate certificate in ecological restoration from the University of Idaho. Since 2003, he has worked for Maui Coastal Land Trust, first as a project manager at the Land Trust 277-acre Waiahi Coastal Dunes and Wetlands Refuge, and is now the Chief Conservation Officer for the Hawaiian Islands Land Trust. In this capacity, he's been involved in all aspects of ecological restoration work on land trust properties. This includes paleo ecology research and reconstructing the history of dominant floral species of Waiahi. Finally, Scott is currently consulting with the U.S. Forest Service on a wetlands restoration project in Madagascar. We're certainly fortunate to have him with us, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Fisher. Aloha, Scott. There he is.
Aloha, everyone. Nice to see you. Aloha mai kako. Thank you very much, Darla, for that introduction. And I will just go ahead and begin to share my screen. Just a moment. There we go. All right. So this evening, as Darla indicated, I'm going to be talking about ecological restoration, paleoecology, and ecosystem resilience, and how to use the distant past, in particular paleoecology, as a guide for resilience-focused ecological restoration. And Waihe'e will be the example that I'll be using, the case study. So it's going to be a presentation in three parts. The first will be a background to the Waihe'e Refuge, with an emphasis on our ecological restoration work there that began in 2003. The second part will be sort of the paradigm shift that we had after the March 11th, 2011 tsunami, when we began our focus on really trying to understand the deep past of the Waihe'e Refuge. So our focus began on paleoecological studies. And so then I'll go into what we learned. And then the third section will be an application of paleoecological data into our ecological restoration work and how we are using that now to focus on our ecological restoration at the refuge. So let me go ahead and begin. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the Waihe'e Coastal Dunes and Wetlands Refuge, it is located on Maui's northwest coast. I'll use my pointer here. So the refuge is 277 acres. It's right on the coastline, about 3 miles outside of Wailuku, going up towards Kahakuloa. So that's the Waihe'e Coastal Dunes and Wetlands Refuge. We purchased the refuge in then the Maui Coastal Land Trust purchased the refuge in July of 2004, although our ecological restoration work had begun about 6 months prior. This is an aerial view, photo taken from a helicopter. This shows very clearly the coastal dunes. These are aeolian or windblown dunes, about 105 acres total of the 277 acres. These sand dunes date back to the late Pleistocene, about 20,000 years ago. Mythologically, they are associated with the goddess Haumea, the goddess of childbirth, who is said to have built these sand dunes in order to serve as a wind protection for a sacred tree known as Kalau Kekahuli, which was planted just on the Mauka side of these dunes. In addition to that, you have the wetlands, 27-acre wetlands, and about 1.5 miles of coastline. And so basically what we say is from Kalai Akehoni to Kalai Kaho'omano. Those are the traditional names of these particular, those particular points. Again, an aerial view, getting a good sense of the wetlands in particular. This is prior to the inauguration of our ecological restoration work. But again, the sand dunes, this mark that you see here, that is an old dairy canal that drains, sadly, unfortunately, drains much of the water that collects in the wetlands. But, and again, for those of you who may recall, the Waihe'i Dairy, the office and the facilities for the Waihe'i Dairy were located right there. This is an archaeological composite map of the Waihe'i Refuge. Waihe'i being a wahipana, a place with many legends and stories associated with it. There are a total of about 93 archaeological sites, state-listed archaeological sites. The oldest is a midden site down here in the area, and people generally refer to as Round Table, but historically is known as Niua. It's the former home of a chief by the name of Hua'apohukaina. This is the oldest site. It's a midden site, but it's also the remains of a village. This is the single largest feature, the Kapoho fish pond. It's a type of fish pond known as a local kalo'i'a. It will factor significantly into the mo'olelo, the story of Waihe'i that I'll be telling tonight. But in addition to that, you have the Kapoho Village, which was a chiefly village that dates to about 1465 until the early 19th century. This is the single largest easily visible feature, and this is Kealaka'i Honua Heiau, most likely a Luakini Heiau. Waihe'i has a large number of heiaus. In fact, of all the ahupua'a on Maui, had probably the third greatest quantity of heiau. There is no longer extant, but there was a heiau at this location, at Kealaka'i Honua Heiau, and of course at Kapoho Fish Pond. And we suspect there may have been several others as well. So in July of 2004, the Maui Coastal Land Trust, the predecessor of the Hawaiian Islands Land Trust, or the Hawaii Land Trust now, purchased the Waihe'i Refuge with 3 goals. The first was to restore degraded ecosystems for the benefit of endangered species, in particular the Ai'o, or the Hawaiian stilt, and the Alai Ke'oke'o. So we focused our initial restoration work on waterbird habitat in the 27-acre wetlands. Our second goal was to provide educational and learning opportunities. So right now we bring down, in normal years, we bring down about 2,000 students annually onto the refuge to provide them with learning opportunities. And we lead about 30 to 40 hikes for the public, for the general public, for anybody who wants to go. We generally are fairly easy to set those up. And the third thing we want to do is preserve and protect the numerous archaeological sites, which I mentioned earlier. So that is our 3 main focus of our work is that in that. So this was the condition of the Waihe'i Refuge when we purchased the property. So this photo was taken in about early 2004, if I recall correctly. And so this particular area here, they've pointed out, is the wetlands. As you can see, the condition of the wetlands, it was basically dominated by Kiave, the Prosopis pallida, another shrub species known as Plukia, and it was also dominated by what's known as Koahaules, or the Lucena leucocephala. So dominated by non-native invasive species. So we had our work cut out for us. This is a photo on the riparian edge. The trees are African tulip. The grasses are a combination of Napier grass or Pennisetum purpureum and Guinea grass, which is Megathyrsus maximus. So again, showing the dominance of invasive species. So our ecological restoration work at Waihe'i focused on restoring the structure, function, and composition of the refuge. So our goal then was to basically improve the productivity, the biodiversity, and to improve resilience. So resilience was an early goal of ours. So the Society for Ecological Restoration defines ecological restoration as an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem with respect to its health, integrity, and sustainability. So that was really our goal. That's what we sought to do. So we just jumped right in, and you can see this is a photo of myself in about early 2004, trying to get in and take down the invasive species. So what you're seeing here is this is actually in the middle of the fish pond. We had to use all hand tools. We could not use any, this is a mower, basically a big lawn mower, cutting down the invasive species. You can see a group of Cenchrus grasses. There's some Kiave in the background. In the foreground here is Pluchia indica, Pluchia carolinensis, and other non-native grasses. So basically it was just have to get in there and remove these invasive species. That was the first order of business. But without volunteers, we could not have really accomplished what we did. And so this is a group of Kamehameha schools, Maui campus, working at the refuge. Again, having to cut everything out by hand and loading it out and taking it out to an area where we could stage the slash. So again, this group of students is actually cutting down some Pluchia, and you can see the Kiave in the background. So, and again, we had a group of volunteers. I just want to point out my colleague, James Crow, and my former colleague, Karen Pollard, who's both of whom are amazing and just incredible workers. And these two volunteers here have been volunteering with us for 14 years now. Every Friday, you can count on them. So just without the input of volunteers, we could never have accomplished what we did in such a short period of time. By about 2007, this was what the refuge looked like. And so this is taken from roughly the same spot as earlier, perhaps a few feet away. But you can see here emerging from the wetlands is the wall of the fish pond, the local kaloi'a. And again, we're also clearing in Kapoho Village. But for the most part, the wetlands have been cleared of most of the invasive species. While this is a more recent picture taken from a drone from roughly the same angle. And you can see it's dominated by indigenous and indigenous sedges, particularly ahuava, akulikuli, an herb species, another herb species, nanea, the vigna marina. So this is what we were able to accomplish. And so this kind of demonstrates how you can restore a wetlands ecosystem. Of course, we are still in the process of trying to get the hydrology fully restored. But what really changed our paradigm, of course, was the March 11, 2011 Tohoku Tsunami, which originated off the coast of Honshu. And in many ways, it was a confirmation of the value of a restored ecosystem, but also served as an opportunity to evaluate how our work might focus on ecological resilience. In addition to habitat improvement for threatened and endangered species, we need to focus on how to make sure that when there is another disturbance, we can actually recover from that as quickly as possible. So ecological resilience is just simply defined as the ability of an ecosystem to absorb the shock of a disturbance, whether it's fire, flood, sea level rise, tsunami, or some other form of anthropogenic or human-caused disturbance, while still retaining its structure, function, and feedbacks. So that was the March 11, 2011 tsunami was absolutely a paradigm shifting event. And so I just want to show several pictures here of a number of slides that show the damage caused by the tsunami. So this here is when the wave pushed through, you can see it caused some severe scouring of our native species. You can see the pohuehue and also some naupaka in the background. Again, same thing here. Some pretty severe scouring, and this is on the edge of the fish pond. In fact, this area here is the fish pond wall. So again, further damaged, the fish pond wall was. And again, from another angle, you can see some of the trees got heavily scoured. The damage, while it was severe, was not nearly as severe as it could have been. Again, is another couple indicators of how that tsunami impacted the coastline. And so again, it was a wake-up call, a paradigm shift, but we learned some lessons. And the lessons that we learned from the tsunami was that the damage to the native species was mainly superficial. There was some damage, of course, that certainly did occur, but we really realized that restored ecosystems rebounded from that disturbance, the tsunami, very quickly. Within 6 to 8 weeks, we could see the native species starting to recover their foliage, and we realized that they had that their roots had actually held the soil. Unrestored areas of the refuge experienced significantly more damage. So just down the coast, and of course, certainly off the property as well, we could see a significant increase in the amount of erosion, and those areas took substantially longer to recover, and they were mainly recovering with non-native species. So I do want to emphasize that the Tohoku tsunami was first and foremost a tragedy. Over 16,000 people lost their lives in Japan, but it was also a natural experiment, and it validated the importance of restored coastal ecosystems. So I think there's something very important that we can learn from that. Really, the challenge after the tsunami became an epistemological question. How can we do our restoration work better? How can we make sure that if we are experiencing coastal inundation, that our native species can protect us in the best way they can? And so a generally accepted hypothesis in ecological restoration suggests that what you do to understand how to restore an ecosystem best, you look to previous ecosystems. So you look to the pre-disturbance structure, function, and composition. And those give you an indication of what are the most resilient ecosystems. So a strategy then suggests that you ought to find reference ecosystems to serve as a model for how you ought to restructure that ecosystem. The challenge there on Maui and across Kapoho, across the archipelago, is that there are no undisturbed coastal ecosystems remaining. They are all, to some degree, over the last 1,000 years, have been modified to some degree. And I'll get to the causes of that in a moment. But we needed a reference ecosystem to understand what was the most resilient ecosystem. And so what we did is we had to turn to paleoecology. So we had been focusing on enhancing the numbers and diversifying the species that were in the general area, but we needed to know what were the deeper, what were the greater number of species from the past. So as I indicate, the tsunami served as a reminder of the need to focus on resilience. So it was our paradigm shift. So in Hawaii in particular, paleoecology can prove extremely insightful. So paleoecology is the branch of ecology that is concerned with the characteristics of ancient environments and with their relationships to plants and animals. So how did the ecosystem structure itself? What were the rules of assembly? How did those relationships endure? And in particular, how did the ecosystem respond to disturbances? So paleoecological techniques include the study of pollen, phytoliths, and diatoms, collectively known as palynology, charcoal, which is known as anthracology and is a quickly growing field, and fossils and subfossils, which most people are aware of is the field of paleontology. Of course, in Hawaii, we don't have any fossils. Our islands are not old enough, but we can look at a number of subfossils, and I'll show you some examples of that. So that's how we put together our knowledge of what the ecosystem was like before humans arrived and before the dramatic modifications occurred. So with that, we set out to gather as much information as possible. And at the same time, I began a conversation with a professor of paleoecology at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. And so in particular, I got involved and was invited to study at the University of Leicester for 3 years, a month at a time, with the Quaternary Paleoecology Research Group. And so Quaternary just referring to the Pleistocene, which is the last 2 million years roughly, and the Holocene, which is the last 12,000 years. So that sent me off to do some studies, a number of studies. And so I spent quite a bit of time staring at the shoreline. This is the shoreline of Waihe'e. And you can see that this here is the outline of an ancient, not entirely sure how old, but several hundred years old at least, imu. So there's a fire pit right there. And so other material that we were able to find included seeds. And so that is a Lo'olu seed that was probably carried down in a flood at some point. Again, we haven't dated this material, but you can see its depth suggests that it's quite old. This is a up close photo of it. So here you can see this the seed of a Pritchardia palm, and I suspected it was Pritchardia, but I had to have it sent off again. To an expert, to someone who really knows Pritchardia. His name is Donald Hodel. He wrote the book on Pritchardia. And again, this is a Pritchardia seed, but in addition to that, if you look real carefully, you can see a leaf and you can see some wood right there. That is actually wood material that got embedded roughly at the same time. And so those all are potential candidates for analysis and determination of the species. Now, when you're talking about a what's known as a lotic system, a flowing system, it could be brought from up above. That's something that when you do palynology at Waihe'e, you get a much more refined sense of what is in that immediate area. So that was quite helpful. And again, this is the subfossil that I was referring to. This is a species of land crab that has been extinct probably, from what we can tell, for about 1,000 years, not too long after humans arrived. This particular species, this is the chalet, or the crab claw, of a species known as Geograpsis severnsi. Since it's extinct, we don't know what its name is in Hawaiian, but the closest relative of it is the Geograpsis grayi, which is known as the Paiea. As you can see, this is what's known as the dactyl. It's the portion of the crab claw that is used, the chalet that they use for grabbing. That proved to be a gold mine, as I'll discuss in a little bit, but that proved to be a gold mine of information because shortly after these crabs die, within about 100 years, they get impacted with sediment. And that sediment almost always includes pollen. And the pollen that we found in there it gave us a really clear indication of what the dominant tree species was. And I should be clear, we had already knew from the previous year's work what the dominant species was, but we are then able to get an indication of truly how dominant it was. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So that is, again, the Geograpsis severnsi. They're very, very commonly found in Waihe'e. And again, my amazing colleague, James Crow, helping me get the sediment cores. So we just basically took our tractor into the wetlands. You can see this is a 2-inch pipe, and this is a post hole pounder. So we would do an initial pounding with our Kubota tractor. And as soon as we got it as far as it would go, we would try and pound just a little bit deeper with our post hole pounder. And then we would extract it using the Kubota tractor. And this is what we found over and over in our sediment cores was this. This is a species, excuse me, this is a specimen of pollen from the Pritchardia, the Lo'olu. And one of the things about pollen that can be a little bit frustrating is that you can only get down to the genus. You can't get down to the species. So the genus is indicated by the pollen, but not the species. And so there's some ambiguity. There's always going to be some degree of ambiguity. And so we have to be aware of that. So, but this is a photograph I took at the University of Leicester of the pollen. This one in particular has been ripped up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see. But in general, pollen can, and under the ideal conditions, pollen can endure for quite literally millions of years. And so, what did we learn from the paleoecological data? The main thing we learned is that from approximately 3,800 years ago, and that's an important date because it's the end of what's known as the mid-Holocene high stand, when sea levels were much higher. So at the end of that mid-Holocene high stand, we were able to get a very clear understanding of what the ecological conditions were. But from about 3,800 years ago until about 1,000 years ago, the Waihe'e area was dominated by a low forest. In fact, it's so dense that the Lo'olu pollen was so abundant that I honestly believe that you probably could not have you definitely could not have walked a straight line. It was what's known as a gallery forest, a forest surrounding a wetlands, but it was a closed canopy gallery forest. So I just can't stress how much pollen of the Lo'olu was there. So that was the confirmation, because we actually had some suspicion that Lo'olu was there. And of course, as you're going to see, we have actually initiated the process of restoring the Lo'olu. I'll talk to you about some of the challenges with that in just a moment. But the pollen of many other species were also present. Of course, these are species that had persisted over many generations. And of course, that's Alveoveo, Kavelu, which is a grass, Ilima, the Cytophallix, again, still found there today, Naupaka, several sedge species. We found all of these pollen, not in abundance. Everything was dominated by the Lo'olu, but they were there. But the other thing that we found quite a bit of is extirpated species, species that are not found in that area any longer, in the Waihe'e area. And that included the Ohemakai and possibly Kawila. Now, when I say possibly Kawila, the reason I specify that as possibly is because there are, what we found is pollen from the plants of the genus Colubrina, and Kawila is one, and there's another called Anapanapa. And so again, it leaves some degree of ambiguity, and that is the art of interpretation involved with ecological restoration and using paleoecological data for restoration. And the other thing we found was, particularly after humans arrived, we could see the spore glomus, which is an indicator of erosion, and that suggested that the fish pond, which dates to about the mid-16th century, mid-1500s, 1550 or so, may have been constructed in addition to being used as a pond for fish and taro, a local kalo'i'a, was possibly also used to trap sediment and to prevent the sediment from getting out onto the shoreline. Darla, did you have a question? Oh, you're muted, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about how it works as a sediment retention basis?
Yeah, sure. So the Waihe'e, the Lo'ikalo, the taro patches between it's kind of central Waihe'e, Mauna Alani to Waihe'e stream are a really fascinating mosaic of ancient taro patches. These are taro patches that go back probably, well, at least several hundred years. We're certain of that. But as you can imagine, anytime you're working in a taro patch, you're also kicking up some sediment, and that sediment gets transported. Waihe'e was I wouldn't say unique, but it was well adapted to having two sediment retention basins. So there was a natural sediment retention basin in a upper, it's Mauka of the road today, at a pond called Pe'eloko or Pai Loko. And then, so all that sediment would be transported to that, that was in the Lo'ikalo, would be transported around and then brought into the fish pond where it would settle again. So you had two sediment retention basins. Now, that soil that would be brought in is nutrient rich, very nutrient rich. And so they could use that soil in order to farm in a method known as kalopu'e, mounded taro. So that's the type of fish, the fish pond that would have, a local kalo'i'a typically had the kalopu'e method of farming. But the indication of glomus, which is typically anthropogenic, it's seen with human activity, and that is erosion. What you see is a lot of it. Now, it's always present somewhere, but when you see a lot of it, and we saw lots and lots of it, the spore glomus, it indicates that there is a lot of erosion occurring, but that erosion was collecting, that eroded material, the sediment was collecting in the fish pond. So it was an indicator of anthropogenic activity, but also that there seemed to be, and this needs to be studied a lot more, and there's a lot of, like any good research, it opened up more questions than it answered. but we need to do more research on the health of the reef around this time, from 1500 to today, to see how the reef responded to these things. My guess is that there are quite a bit of indications of ongoing reef health in the period between at least 1500 and 1800. So yeah.
Yeah, there's one question that came in from Fern Duval, and maybe you're going to address this in the next point, but she asks, when did Rattus remains show up with humans?
I'm sorry, when did what remains?
Rattus.
Oh, Rattus. Yes, that, you know what? In fact, the first picture that that I showed, where you could see the old imu, the fire pit. Around that fire pit, I found numerous rat jawbones. And so yes, the Rattus exulans, which I'm going to get to, is the main culprit, is the main driver of ecosystem change. It is I guess you could say the villain in this situation. Found abundantly around the human, around the village at Niua. And so yes, yeah, thank you, Fern, appreciate that. So the presence of the spore glomus indicates to us, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but really indicates to us the necessity of restoring the fish pond today, because we need something to act as a sediment retention basin that can also raise fish, and we can restore our lo'i productivity. So dramatic ecological change, particularly the loss of the lo'ulu, came about soon after the arrival of humans. So you see an increase in both glomus and charcoal, and you see a decrease in pollen. And that's about 100 or 200 years after humans arrived. You see just a steady decrease. Within about a couple hundred years, it's gone. Now, these dates are still tentative because we need to do more dating. Some of the dates that we have are suggestive, but they're not definitive. So again, what are the main culprits what are the main drivers of ecosystem change? And I'll get to about 6 of them. So the first question, of course, comes, was it direct human impact? Was there direct impact by humans? And the general answer that I give is that there may have been some. We do see, for example, I did find one emu that had the Geograpsis severnsi, remains of the chalet of the crab in the actual pit. So there was likely some predation. Another possible culprit was fire for agricultural clearing. As I indicated, there was a dramatic increase in the use of fire, as indicated by the quantity of charcoal in our sediment cores. Really, all indicators, or most indicators, point to the introduction of the iole, the Rattus exulans, or the Pacific rat, as the main driver of ecological change. In some archaeological studies, they may have numbered, the suggestions that they may have numbered in the thousands per hectare. So that's a dramatic, well, there were no predatory mammals, no terrestrial mammals at all prior to humans arriving. So that was the iole arriving commensally with humans about 950 AD, around 950. So other possible drivers of ecosystem change, pathogens, the most widely suggested, although nothing's been proven, pathogen that could have been brought is avian diseases with chickens, with the moa. Something else we should probably give consideration to is insects such as ants. Ants can do tremendous damage to ecosystems, and this is going on right now. And the Indian Ocean island of Christmas Island is a very good indicator of how quickly this ecosystem or regime shifts can occur, the ecological change can happen. The ants, it's the yellow crazy ant there, is eating the land crabs. The land crabs kept the vegetation manicured, essentially, and that facilitated seabirds. So when you lose the seabirds, you lose the nutrients that those seabirds deposit in their guano. And well, you lose the crabs, then you lose the seabirds because the ecosystem changes. And then, of course, the 6th is a combination of some or all of the above. I think we have to give at least, nobody knows for sure, but we have to give ample time to actually explore whether or not this is the case. So how do we apply the paleoecological insights into resilience-focused ecological restoration? So climate change introduces a whole new set of uncertainties, and some of the likely impacts that we can anticipate with climate change is sea level rise, more frequent and intense storms, which will, of course, exacerbate erosion on the dunes, on the coastal dunes, and along the higher dunes as well. So we have to be prepared for that. We also anticipate coastal inundation, more likely through sea level rise, and also possibly drought, which our native species need to be prepared for. We need to plant species in anticipation of that. So, I guess the moral of the story is implementing resilience measures now before we experience excessive erosion and coastal inundation is more critical than ever. We need to act now, and that's the takeaway message of our resilience-focused restoration. So, how do we apply this? So while for at least several thousand years the Lo'olu palm dominated coastal Waihe'e, the Rattus exulans is still doing tremendous damage to the Lo'olu that we plant. We planted well over 100, and we're experiencing significant predation. They will eat just about every part of the plant. I'll show you in just a moment how that is impacting us. So, resilience focus suggests, that if they were dominant for 3,800 years, at least up to 1,000 years ago, that they are probably an ideally suited species to promote resilience. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, their suitability is diminished by their vulnerability to rat predation. And the other takeaway, as I mentioned, was that restoring the fish pond, which again, as I mentioned, acts as a sediment trap, is important to protect the fringing reef. The importance of protecting at all costs the Waihe'e reef, Maui's largest fringing reef, can't be understated. It is critically important because that fringing reef is what we can count on to protect our other vulnerable spots. So there has to be that ho'iho'iho. We have to have that reciprocity between the land and the ocean. So it's critical. So restoring the fish pond is absolutely critical, and we are actually actively involved in attempting to get water back into the Waihe'e stream, or into the fish pond from the Waihe'e stream, I should say. So I just want to point out the damage by the Rattus exulans, the Iole, to the Lo'olu. So as you can see, this is some rat gnawing on the Lo'olu. There's some here as well. Again, you can see some rat gnawing here, and of course, the primary bud, the branch that comes out, is very vulnerable, and if that is lost, if that's gnawed on by rats, the whole tree will die. So what we've kind of turned to, in addition to, we are still planting lots of Lo'olu because it is a great species. We're just trying to be as careful. But when we lose a Lo'olu in particular, we're losing years and years of time and effort. They grow incredibly slowly, and if we can get more biodiversity, a diverse array of species, we are going to be we feel in a much better position. So Holla pandanus is an alternative, as its architecture, the tree architecture, is ideal for capturing wave energy, whether it's a tsunami or coastal inundation from a large storm, but they are not subject to rat predation. So what we're ultimately trying to do is use Holla in conjunction with other species, again, focusing on biodiversity, to allow us to create a forested bioshield, a shield to protect the refuge from dune erosion and coastal inundation. So I just want to point this picture out. This indicates how ideal a Holla is. I mean, this is, the architecture, the tree architecture is meant to really slow down. I mean, not meant, but it is ideal for slowing down wave energy. So forested bioshield, the generally accepted distance is about 3 feet apart, can create a very effective forested bioshield. And that comes from studies of coastal tsunamis, of what they've been trying in other areas. So again, there's my coworker James, and here we are planting our inland portion of our forested bioshield. This is Holla here. We have our sedge ahuava here, and don't look here, those are weeds. but that is the early stages of our forested bioshield. They are growing up now. And again, getting back to our volunteers, you can see all from this point here, these are a little bit older examples of the Holla coming in, but these are, as they mature, they will give us that protection. Now, we're not so worried about coastal inundation here as much as a very large storm causing erosion, and that erosion, that sandy material getting deposited into the wetlands, and that causing disrupting habitat for our wetland birds, which we've been working so hard to provide habitat for. So again, this is on the edge of the wetlands. Again, Kaluha here, that's the native sedge there. So some conclusions that we came to. So as climate changes and we face more frequent coastal inundations, storms, and severe erosion, ecological restoration work should adopt a resilience focus. That's our lesson learned. Past ecological conditions can be understood through paleoecological data, and we want to make sure that we actually understand as best we can how those past disturbances affected ecosystems and how we can use that information to actually enhance our resilience quotient. So paleoecology, however, is a starting point, not the end point. It should really be thought of as what sets you down a path for resilience-focused ecological restoration. So mahalo nui to everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Just want to say how much we have, over the last almost 18 years now, relied on our kupuna to guide us. And this is one of the kupuna, Diana Laigu, who passed away about a year ago, but she was an incredible kupuna. Just so much ike kupuna, so much ancestral wisdom. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, well, we do have some questions, but I did want to thank you, Dr. Scott Fisher, for your presentation about the work at Hawaiian Islands Land Trust. And it was very interesting. I learned quite a few things. So Michael Stanley asks, we're going to go back to glomus for a minute. What's the connection between glomus and human presence?
Yes, good. Okay, so yeah, thank you. Glomus is present all the time. I mean, you find it commonly. In fact, if you probably picked up a teaspoon of soil, you would probably find some glomus. But when you see it heavily concentrated, it's an indicator that there is erosion occurring. And so that prevalence and persistence of erosion is what paleoecologists use as an indicator of erosion. So basically, when you see it in high concentrations, a little bit here or there, it's probably not an indicator. So for example, in the very early layers of our sediment cores, we found almost none, but there were some, but virtually none. And then as human activity increased, we saw quite a bit higher concentrations of glomus. So it's just an indicator. It's just something that we use as a proxy for erosion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that human activity is driving that erosion. There could be a flank collapse or a landslide or something like that. That's completely natural. So it's not like it's an indication of humans, it's an indication of erosion. But if you see it over time in conjunction with other proxies like charcoal or rat teeth, which we found abundantly in the area, as a macrofossil, not a microfossil, that's the indication. So yeah, that's the indicator.
Okay. Well, Andrew Fox wants to know, are there similar pollen maps for other parts of the coastline to guide restoration there?
Many places have actually done sediment coring. So we've also done sediment coring at Nu'u, and there we got quite a bit of a surprise. Of course, 2 of the dominant species before humans arrived were expected. Not expected, but commonly found in the coast. At Nu'u, this is in the Kaupo district, in the Moku of Kaupo, we also found the Myrsaini, the Kolea tree, which we didn't find hardly any Lolu. So that was a big surprise. So The answer to the question is yes, absolutely. Many places. Point you to Dr. Stephen Athens has done quite a bit of work on the island of Oahu and some on Kaho'olawe, although that was in the 80s, so I think it needs to be updated. But yeah, of course, probably the most prolific writer on paleoecology is Dr. David Burney, who has done quite a bit of work at the Makauwahi Caves. And this is much of what he did is the inspiration for the work we've done. So I do want to recognize him as well.
Sure. Ann Fielding was asking, how do you plan to manage the Holla scale?
Good question. That is a good question. We have Holla scale. And fortunately, it does not seem to be in enough abundance to actually do much damage to the Holla. It's aesthetically displeasing, and unfortunately, it makes it less appealing for people who are using the Holla for traditional and cultural purposes, which we would like to make abundantly available since we're going to be planting so much. The simple answer is none. We don't have any plan for it. If it becomes too acute, we will of course address it as it comes up.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Irina Bliss wants to know, well, first she says, mahalo nui to you. When might you anticipate restoring the freshwater and fish pond?
Yeah. So we are, as soon as possible is the simple answer. It will take some time to work through the courts to get legal right to actually have the water. Not to get too much in the details of the contested water case, but we were successful in the first round, mainly through the hard work of the Huia Navai Eha, but we were successful in getting about 10 million gallons put back into Waihe'i Stream in 2010. Sadly, the hearings officer who wrote the ruling said, but none can be taken into the Kapoho fish pond. So we appealed that, and we've been in appeal on that since at least 2016. So it's been quite a while. It has to navigate its way through the courts. And so I don't really have any answer for that, other than as soon as that happens, we would like to get involved in actually restoring the fish pond. We are pursuing the initial steps of getting the permits to actually rebuild the fish pond walls. So that may be taking place relatively soon. We have archaeologists who are very interested in helping us understand how that system really functioned. We have a fairly good sense, but we need to go a little bit deeper. In general, the deeper you go on these things, the more likely you are to make wise decisions about how to execute such a project.
Okay, back to Holla for a minute. Geraldo Farrington asked, what percentage of area cover of Holla versus Lolu are you targeting, and why? Or are the Holla stands being placed at strategic points or rows to protect particular regions of the shoreline and or sand dunes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, they are being strategically, although we need to be consistent with their what are known as their rules of assembly. So we are putting them, if you can imagine, a belt around the wetlands. We are putting them in a belt around the wetlands to prevent inundation from sand into the wetlands if there's a heavy storm. Well, at the same time, we are putting them along the shoreline in order to prevent coastal inundation. So just tsunamis are by far the most likely event to happen. So Maui has not been hit directly by a hurricane since 1836. That's directly by a hurricane. We've gotten a number of glancing blows and had some damage. So I don't want to downplay the impact of hurricanes, but that's since 1836. Maui's not been hit by a massive hurricane, large hurricane. In that same time, roughly, so a little bit before that, since 1812, there's been 46 tsunamis. So tsunamis are a major threat to the coastline. So we need to work on both, but we started with the Mauka band of Holla because every rain brings down a little bit more sand, and we want to secure those dunes. While along the coast, we also have to be planting. So there's no magical formula. What we do is, when we get when we get Lolu ready to plant, we plant it. And if it survives, that's great. We're doing our best to take measures to prevent rat predation by putting metal bands around the low. I'm not sure if I said Holla, but around the low, we put metal bands that prevent the rats. But they are persistent. I cannot believe how persistent rats can be. They will eat an entire grouping of seeds that we were trying to protect. If they get any opportunity, they'll wipe them out. It's unbelievable. They go. It's like they go crazy for Lolu. They love Lolu, and it's unfortunate. So.
Well, that probably answers Natalie Rothman's question. She's one of your fellow CSU grads.
All right.
And she was also asking about controlling the rat population. So is it not feasible? Or not feasible organically, probably.
Yeah. We don't have any, predators keep us very busy, and we don't have a predator-proof fence around. If we could do what they do in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we'd be in a very different situation. They have definitively committed themselves to ensuring the protection of their natural ecosystems. And if that were the case, then I could say, well, we could make some progress. We're not at that point yet.
Are you talking about in New Zealand preventing them from coming in the first place, or?
Well, they have I'm certainly not an expert in their strategies, but they have they've developed fences that can keep out down to predators down to the size of a mouse. Now, I don't, we have predators from dogs, cats, rats, mongoose, barn owls, cattle egret, we mynah birds. We have all kinds of predators. I mean, the range of predators that we have, and so it's just, we're trying to unravel the problem one step at a time. And if we can find a species that architecturally, arboreal architecture is suitable for stopping wave inundation and massive erosion, we'll pursue that. While at the same time, I would love to see a Lolu forest restored. It's just at this point in history, it's just not entirely feasible, I don't think.
Okay.
Much as I would love to see that happen.
So Jay Penniman asks, is there anything in the paleostrata indicating the presence of seabirds?
Yes, and in fact, I should have pointed it out if I can go back to go back a few photographs. Apologize, but you can see, excuse me, that was the photo I was looking for. In this photo right there, you can see the end, the hollow bone of a seabird. The simple answer, Jay, is that we find relatively few seabird bones and an extreme abundance of Geograpsis. Probably because they're more durable. The Geograpsis chalet are more durable. They persist more over time. And we also, because of the concern about finding iwi kupuna, we don't dig. Everything that we look for is on the surface. Iwi kupuna human remains, the Mauna Ihi, the sand dunes are known to contain iwi kupuna. So we have to be very careful about that. So we don't dig anything. Undoubtedly there are, and that's another phase of the study. Yeah, absolutely. We need to do a more comprehensive accounting of the species that at Waihe'e. That's again the next step. Because seabirds are critically important to the ecosystem, and we need to get them back, mainly because they fulfill that nutrient exchange. The nutrients that seabirds bring are critical to all of us, to the persistence of our native ecosystems, as well as our anthropogenic ecosystems as well.
Sure. This is going to be the last question. So, if anyone has further questions, they can contact Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, make sure that they get to Scott. But I thought this one was really interesting. Irina Ploy says, this is an observation I made on King's Trail from Hana Airport going to Wainapa. There's many, many Holla trees with lilikoi growing all over it, seem to be doing really well. I wonder if there's symbiosis.
I don't know if that, I don't know if that's the case. I've never looked into that, so I'm not sure. Of course, and I'm just trying to think if my experience in Central America, if I've ever seen them together. Of course, lilikoi is an introduced species, so I don't know if there would be a symbiotic relationship here, but it'd be something to definitely explore.
Okay, well, again, just great questions, everyone, too, and thank you.
Yeah, thank
so
you.
much.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Scott Fisher, and thank you, Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, for hosting this as part of the Know Your Ocean Speaker Series. Maui Nui Marine Resource Council is a nonprofit organization working for clean ocean water, healthy coral reefs, and an abundance of native fish for all the islands of Maui County. To learn more about Maui Nui Marine Resource Council and sign up for their free e-newsletter, which will keep you updated on all these great future events, please visit mauireefs.org. If you'd like to support Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's work, please donate at mauireefs.org, and you can pick out a thank you gift. I love that shirt right there. I have that one. And if you have enjoyed tonight's presentation, please share it on Facebook. You'll find it at Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's Facebook page. You can also listen to my interviews with the series of presenters under this series Sunday at 9 a.m. on my weekly program, Island Environment 360, on all 4 HY media radio stations. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. On behalf of myself and Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, aloha.